Sometimes the most powerful people walk among us unnoticed. And sometimes arrogance doesn't fall from power. It takes the elevator straight to meet it. It was a Monday morning in Manhattan, a city that runs on ambition, caffeine, and pride. The lobby of Everline Industries gleamed like a temple of success, filled with polished shoes, expensive watches, and voices that spoke only the language of money. Then he walked in, quiet, calm, almost invisible. A man in a worn gray suit, shoes dusted from the morning rain, and eyes that carried more wisdom than wealth. No entourage, no badge of importance. Just a folder in his hand and a purpose in his stride. He pressed a button for the 42nd floor. The top, people glanced at him, then looked away, assuming he was lost. Moments later, the elevator door slid open. Out stepped Richard Hale, the CEO himself. Tailored suit, diamond watch, confidence sharper than his tie pin. He stepped in without looking up, phone in hand, lost in the noise of his own importance. The elevator doors closed, trapping them in a silence thick enough to cut. Heading to 42? The older man asked gently. Richard sighed. Yeah, please, no small talk. I've got a board meeting. The man smiled faintly. I know, he said softly. I'm attending, too. Richard scoffed. Right. I'll believe that when I see it. He didn't know it yet, but the man he just dismissed was the one who owned everything above that 42nd floor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Richard Hale stepped out like he owned the floor. His stride was sharp. His reflection in the glass walls seemed to nod in agreement. Yes, this was his kingdom. Behind him, the older man followed at a calm pace. No rush. No need to keep up. But Richard didn't even glance back. He let the door swing shut behind him without a thought. Inside the boardroom, the hum of quiet power filled the air. Papers shuffling, pens clicking, and the faint clinking of coffee cups on marble. The executives of Everline Industries, men and women dressed to impress, rehearsing smiles they only use for the rich and powerful. Morning, everyone, Richard said briskly, tossing his briefcase onto the table. Let's make this quick. I've got investors waiting on a 7-figure call. His voice carried authority, the kind that came from years of being obeyed. He didn't notice the subtle shift in the room, the glances toward the door, the faint unease in the air, because at that very moment, the door opened again. Every conversation stopped, and in walked a man from the elevator, the one in the worn gray suit, still quiet, still calm. But this time, all eyes were on him. He walked with quiet assurance, that same folder tucked under his arm, the one that suddenly looked far more important than Richard had assumed. A board member, the company's legal counsel, quickly stood up, adjusting his tie. Mr. Langston, he said with a nervous smile. Welcome, sir. The air changed. You could feel the tension ripple across the room. Richard froze. Mr. Langston? The name hit him like a crack of thunder. Jonathan Langston, the mysterious majority shareholder who had quietly acquired 52% of Everline stock over the past year. The man who, technically, owned the company. Langston smiled politely, unbothered by the stunned faces around him. Good to see you all again, he said, voice calm but commanding. Sorry I'm late. The elevator ride was enlightening. He stepped past Richard and placed his folder, not just anywhere, but at the head of the table. Richard's seat, the same seat that, until 10 seconds ago, everyone believed belonged to the most powerful man in the room. Now, Richard could only stand there, realizing that the man he dismissed moments earlier was the one who'd been quietly deciding his future all along. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. You could almost hear the pulse in Richard's neck as he tried to process what had just happened. Every executive stared straight ahead, afraid to breathe, afraid to move. Finally, Richard forced a nervous smile. I'm sorry, he said, his voice catching. I don't think we've properly met. Langston didn't flinch. He simply looked up from the folder, eyes calm but sharp. Oh, we've met, he said evenly, this morning in the elevator. You were too busy for introductions. The words landed like a quiet explosion. No anger, no raised voice. Just truth, cool, effortless, and impossible to escape. Langston opened his worn gray folder, the same one Richard had dismissed a moment ago, and spread several neatly stacked documents across the table. The golden company seal gleamed faintly under the conference lights. As of last week, he said, his tone steady and deliberate, the Langston Group finalized its acquisition of 51% of Everline Industries. He paused, letting that sentence sink in. Effective immediately, he continued. This company operates under joint control, and I'll be personally overseeing a full leadership restructuring. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was a faint, rhythmic ticking of the silver clock on the wall, a reminder that every second of silence was rewriting Richard Hale's career. Richard's throat went dry. His confident posture crumbled. You're the investor? He stammered. The one buying up our shares? Langston looked up again, that faint, knowing smile returning. The majority shareholder, he said simply. To be exact. He leaned back in his chair, fingers clasped, studying the man who had once refused to make eye contact with him. And to think, he said softly, you told me not to make small talk. A ripple of awkward chuckles moved around the table, nervous, half-hearted. No one dared look directly at Richard. Langston's tone shifted, not cruel, but calm, reflective. You see, Mr. Hale, he began, I didn't inherit my position. I earned it one night shift at a time. I started mopping floors in buildings just like this one. His voice deepened, each word deliberate. I've met people who smiled at my face when they saw my badge and ignored me when I carried a mop. That's how I learned what character really means. He closed the folder slowly and looked Richard squarely in the eyes. So, whenever I acquire a company, he said, I test its people. I like to see how they treat someone they think can help them before I decide who's worth keeping. The room felt colder now. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher. Langston's final words landed with quiet force. Today, Mr. Hale, he said, you gave me my answer. The CO, once untouchable, sat frozen in his chair, his reflection in the glossy table no longer looking powerful, just small. And across from him, the man in the gray suit, once invisible, now sat at the head of the empire he owned, calm, collected, and entirely in control. The silence stretched long after Langston's words faded. Richard sat there, shoulders tense, heart pounding so loud he could hear it echo against the boardroom walls. The man who had walked in certain of his power now looked like he was shrinking beneath the weight of his own arrogance. Finally, he found his voice. Mr. Langston, he said, his tone cracking, I didn't mean to disrespect you. Langston's gaze softened, but his reply was measured, a calm, controlled truth that cut deeper than anger ever could. You didn't have to mean it, he said quietly. You just had to show it. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in the stillness that followed. Langston turned slowly toward the rest of the board, a sea of uneasy faces avoiding his eyes. Effective immediately, he said, voice firm. I'll be conducting a full review of leadership behavior and company culture. Every department, every manager. He paused, glancing around the table. I built businesses from the ground up, and the ones that failed. He tapped the folder once gently. They didn't fail because of bad numbers. They failed because of bad attitudes. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One cleared his throat. That's long overdue, he admitted quietly. Langston's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Good, he said, because somewhere along the line, people here forgot what respect looks like. They become so busy staring down at their phones. They stopped looking up at the world that built them. He stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm, the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. Meeting adjourned, he said simply. Chairs creaked as everyone rose, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. As Langston moved toward the door, he slowed beside Richard. The CEO, or rather, the former CEO, couldn't meet his eyes. Langston looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in a low, even tone, the kind that lingered long after he was gone. Next time you share an elevator, Mr. Hale, he said, look the person beside you in the eye, because you never know who's really holding the buttons. Then he walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed a masterclass in quiet power. And as the elevator doors closed behind him this time, it wasn't Richard pressing the buttons. It was the man he'd ignored, the very same man now in control of everything he thought he owned. Word spread like wildfire. By noon, every floor at Everline Industries had heard the story. They whispered about it in the elevators, in the cafeteria line, even in the parking garage. The CEO ignored a man in the elevator, and that man turned out to be the majority shareholder. They called it the elevator lesson, and it changed everything. For the first time in years, the company felt human again. Meetings started on time, not out of fear, but out of respect. People smiled in hallways, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And Richard Hale, the man who once measured worth by wardrobe and watch brand, was no longer the same. Every morning after that, he took the main elevator. No more key card to skip the crowd. No more silent ride staring at his phone. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the very people he once overlooked. Interns clutching coffee trays, janitors pushing supply carts, receptionists balancing phone calls and smiles. And every single time he greeted them by name, "Good morning, Louise. How's your son, Dana? Hey, Mel, those reports yesterday were sharp." It wasn't performative. It was real. He had finally learned what leadership actually looked like, not being above others, but walking among them. Langston's influence rippled to the company like sunlight breaking through clouds. Training programs were rewritten. Promotion policies were reviewed. Respect wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a foundation. Then one Monday morning, new posters appeared on every floor. White background, black letters. Simple and bold. Respect everyone, not because of their title, but because of your own. Charles Langston, majority shareholder. Employees stopped to read it. Some smiled. Others just nodded quietly. But everyone, from the mailroom to the boardroom, understood what it meant. It wasn't just a quote. It was a mirror. And for the first time, Everline Industries could finally look at its reflection and be proud. He had ignored the man beside him, not out of malice, but out of arrogance. He saw a worn suit, a tired face, a stranger who didn't look important. But what he failed to recognize was the quiet power that humility wears so well. That morning ride, less than 60 seconds between the lobby and the 42nd floor, became the most valuable lesson of his life. Because in those silent moments, pride spoke louder than respect, and the price of that silence changed everything. From that day on, every time Richard Hale stepped into an elevator, he felt it, that hum, that pause, that echo of what happened. He remembered the man who smiled when he didn't have to, the man who owned not just a company, but the kind of dignity no paycheck could buy. And as the doors closed behind him, he'd whisper the words that reshaped his entire world. Never look down on someone in the elevator, because one day you might just be standing beside the person who owns the building. The elevator still rose to the same floors, but for Richard, it would never feel the same again.